Elias Thorne was a man who traded in silence. As a high-level data analyst for a global hedge fund, his brain was a buzzing hive of numbers, tickers, and constant digital noise. When his doctor warned him that his chronic migraines and auditory burnout were bordering on a nervous breakdown, Elias decided to do something radical. He signed a 3-month lease for Blackwood Manor, an estate tucked deep into the valleys of the Appalachian Mountains. The contract was peculiar. It was managed by a firm called the Quiet Group. The primary clause stated, "The tenant agrees to maintain absolute acoustic isolation. No celular devices, no rádios, no digital playback." In return, Blackwood Manor provides the only true silence left on Earth. Elias arrived at sunset. The house was a masterpiece of mid-century modern architecture: glass, steel, and heavy concrete, sunken into the side of a mountain. But it was the walls that fascinated him. They were 3 feet thick, lined with a specialized acoustic foam that swallowed every vibration. As the heavy steel front door hissed shut behind him, Elias felt a physical weight lift off his shoulders. He clapped his hands once. The sound didn't echo. It didn't ring. It simply died the moment his palms met. The foam swallowed the noise so hungrily that it made his ears pop. "Perfect," Elias whispered. He couldn't even hear the air conditioning. The house used a silent geothermal cooling system. He spent the first night in a state of bliss. For the first time in 10 years, the ringing in his ears, his tinnitus, seemed to fade. He slept in a bedroom that was essentially a sensory deprivation tank. But at 3:14 a.m., Elias woke up. He lay in the total darkness, breathing softly. In the absolute silence, he began to hear his own body. He heard the wet slide of his eyelids as he blinked. He heard the rhythmic thump whoosh of blood pumping through the carotid artery in his neck. Then, he heard something else. It was a soft, rhythmic scratching. It wasn't coming from outside. It wasn't coming from the walls. It sounded like it was coming from inside his own ear canal. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Elias sat up, rubbing his ear. The sound stopped. He waited, holding his breath. The silence of the house was so intense it felt like a vacuum pressing against his eardrums. Then a voice, thin, dry, and sounding as if it were being spoken through a mouthful of sand, vibrated against his inner ear bone. "Elias, you're finally quiet enough to listen." Elias spent the morning scrubbing his ears with a warm washcloth, convinced he had a buildup of wax or perhaps a stray insect. "It's the silence," he muttered to the kitchen tile. "The brain hates a vacuum. It manufactures noise to fill the void." He spent the day trying to read, but the silence of Blackwood Manor was becoming aggressive. In a normal house, you hear the house settle, the creak of wood, the hum of a refrigerator. Here, there was nothing. The silence was so thick it felt like he was submerged in oil. Seeking a distraction, Elias explored the basement. Behind a heavy, sound-baffled door, he found a room that wasn't on the floor plan. It was a library, but there were no printed books. Instead, the shelves were lined with hundreds of identical black moleskine notebooks. He pulled one off the shelf. It was dated October 1998. Day 14. "The silence is no longer outside. It has moved into my marrow. I can hear my digestion. It sounds like a landslide. I can hear my nerves firing, tiny electrical pops in my skull. But there is another sound, a frequency. It's a low hum that sounds like a name. My name." Elias felt a chill. He opened another book from 2012. The Quiet Group didn't tell me what the foam is made of. I cut a piece open today. It's not foam. It's porous like bone. It's drinking the sound, but where does the sound go? It doesn't just vanish. Energy cannot be destroyed. The house is storing it. The house is a battery, and I am the terminal. The last few pages of the 2012 journal were illegible, covered in dark, brownish-red stains. The handwriting devolved into a single, repeated sentence. "If I can't hear it, IT can't be real." Elias dropped the book. As it hit the floor, the sound was muffled, but in the heightened sensitivity of his hearing, it sounded like a gunshot. He turned to leave, but his foot caught on a loose floorboard. Underneath, hidden in the shadows, was a small pile of rusted metal objects. He leaned down and realized with a jolt of horror what they were. They were surgical bone curettes and heavy-duty sewing needles. Beside them lay a pair of industrial ear defenders, caked in dry blood. Elias backed away, his heart hammering. The sound of his heartbeat was now a deafening roar in his ears. Thump, 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 thump. And then the voice returned. It was clearer this time, no longer a whisper, but a resonant vibration that seemed to bypass his ears entirely and echo directly in his frontal lobe. "Why are you running, Elias? Don't you want to hear what the walls have been saving for you?" Elias clutched his head. "There's no one here. I'm alone. This is a sensory deprivation hallucination." He scrambled up the stairs and bolted the basement door. He ran to the living room and grabbed a heavy glass vase, smashing it against the concrete floor. He needed a sound, any sound to drown out the voice. But the acoustic foam was too efficient. The crash lasted for a fraction of a second before the room went dead again. Then he heard a new sound, a sound that shouldn't be possible in a soundproofed house. From the other side of the glass walls, out in the forest where there was no wind, he heard the sound of thousands of people screaming. But the sound wasn't coming from the air. It was coming from the ground. Elias pressed his hands against the massive glass panes. Outside, the trees stood like frozen ghosts in the moonlight. There was no wind to move the leaves, no owls calling, no insects chirping. Yet, the sound of the screaming persisted. It was a low-frequency vibration that traveled up through the soles of his feet, vibrating his teeth in their sockets. He realized then that the house wasn't soundproofed to keep the world out. It was soundproof to keep him in. He ran to the kitchen and grabbed a glass of water, setting it on the counter. The surface of the water wasn't still. It was dancing in complex, geometric patterns, cymatics. The house was being hit by an infrasonic wave, a sound so low the human ear couldn't hear it, but the human body could feel. It is pure, unadulterated terror. The subsonic well, Elias whispered. He remembered a theory he'd read during his research into auditory burnout. Certain geological formations, specifically those rich in quartz and magnetite, could act as natural recording devices. They could trap the acoustic signatures of traumatic events. He returned to the basement, driven by a desperate need to understand. He ignored the blood-stained journals and looked at the walls themselves. He peeled back a corner of the acoustic foam. Behind it wasn't concrete. It was a network of copper wires embedded in a translucent, bone-like resin. The wires pulsed with a faint, rhythmic glow. It's a microphone, he realized. The whole house is a giant diaphragm. Suddenly, the floor beneath him tilted, or at least his vestibular system told him it did. The earth hum shifted frequency. The screaming outside stopped, replaced by a sound much worse, the sound of a single breath. It was a wet, rattling inhalation that lasted for nearly a minute. It was the sound of a giant lung made of stone and soil. Then, the voice in his head spoke again, but this time it wasn't just one. It was a chorus of the voices from the black notebooks. The earth remembers every scream, Elias. It remembers the miners trapped in the collapse of 42. It remembers the hikers lost in the blizzard of 78. We are the noise the world tried to forget. And you are the new recorder. Elias felt a sharp, stabbing pain in his ears. A trickle of warmth ran down his neck. He reached up and touched his earlobe. His hand came away red. The pressure was increasing. The house was tuning him. By stripping away all external sound, the quiet group had made his nervous system so sensitive that he was now picking up this static of the dead from the very tectonic plates below. He grabbed a heavy wrench from a nearby toolbox and began to smash at the copper wiring in the wall. He had to break the circuit. But as the wrench hit the resin, the house didn't just vibrate. It shrieked, a sound so loud and so high-pitched that the glass vase in the upstairs living room didn't just break, it turned into dust. Elias fell to his knees, clutching his head as the walls began to glow with a sickly, rhythmic light. The shriek of the house subsided, but it didn't leave Elias in silence. It left him in a world that had been fundamentally rewritten. When he opened his eyes, the basement was no longer dark. The sound of his own heavy breathing was manifesting as pulses of jagged, electric blue light that rippled across the ceiling. Every heartbeat sent a thud of crimson through his vision. He was experiencing synesthesia, the crossing of his senses. The earth hum had pushed his auditory cortex into an evolutionary overdrive. "I have to get out," he wheezed, but even his own voice looked like a cloud of gray ash floating in the air. He stumbled up the stairs and burst through the front door. The mountain air was cold, but the silence outside was a lie. The forest was glowing. He saw the subsonic well, now giant, invisible pillars of vibrating energy rising from the ground like the ribs of a cathedral. They were a pale, sickly violet. He ran to his SUV and jammed the key into the ignition. Click, click. The dashboard lights flickered and died. The hum wasn't just a sound, it was an electromagnetic pulse. The quartz-rich soil below had acted as a giant capacitor, discharging enough energy to fry every circuit in the vehicle. Elias slammed his fist against the steering wheel. The impact created a golden ring of light that expanded outward, hitting the windshield and revealing something terrifying. In the forest, standing just beyond the tree line, were the listeners. They were tall, thin shapes, their bodies covered in the same acoustic resin as the basement walls. They had no eyes, no noses, only massive, oversized ears that twitched in the direction of any vibration. They were the previous tenants, the ones who had stayed to become part of the quiet group's harvest. One of them tilted its head. Elias had accidentally honked the horn. The golden ring of light from the horn blast reached the listener. It reacted instantly, moving with a jerky, unnatural speed toward the car. It didn't run. It seemed to slide along the frequency of the sound. Elias scrambled out of the passenger side and sprinted toward the only place that wasn't glowing violet, a rocky outcrop near the edge of a steep ravine. As he ran, his own footsteps were his greatest enemy. Every crunch of a dry leaf sent out a flare of yellow light, a beacon for the things in the woods. He had to learn to move below the frequency. He reached the rocks and pressed himself into a narrow crevice. He clamped his hands over his mouth, trying to stifle the sound of his lungs. Through the narrow gap, he watched as a listener drifted past. It stopped just inches from his hiding spot. It was vibrating so intensely that the air around it hummed like a beehive. The creature leaned in, its massive, fleshy ear canal pulsing. Then, Elias's watch, the old-fashioned mechanical one his father had given him, gave a single, sharp tick. The listener's head snapped toward the crevice. The listener's ear was inches from the rock, a dark, cavernous hole that seemed to drink the very air. Elias froze. His mechanical watch felt like a ticking time bomb against his wrist. Tick, tick, tick. To the creature, that tiny mechanical sound was a beacon. The listener began to reach into the crevice with fingers that looked like elongated tuning forks. In a moment of pure, desperate instinct, Elias didn't try to be silent. He remembered a principle from his physics minor: active noise cancellation. If you play a sound wave that is the exact mathematical opposite, 180 degrees out of phase, of another wave, they collide and erase each other. He didn't have a computer, but he had his voice. He listened to the low, vibrating hum of the creature, a deep, rhythmic thrum, thrum, thrum. He opened his mouth and let out a low, guttural drone, trying to match the frequency, but shifting the timing just slightly. It was a phase shift scream. The listener recoiled. Its massive ear twitched violently as the two frequencies collided in the air, creating a dead zone of silence. To the creature, Elias had suddenly become a hole in reality. He was invisible. Elias didn't wait. He scrambled out of the crevice and sprinted toward the maintenance shed near the geothermal cooling units. Inside, the shed was filled with industrial tools and coils of copper. He grabbed a heavy-duty car battery, a spool of wire, and a set of high-output horn speakers used for mountain alerts. "I can't hide forever," Elias whispered, his vision still flickering with the crimson pulses of his own adrenaline. "I have to broadcast a signal so loud it shatters their sensors." He began to wire the speakers to the battery, but he realized a fatal flaw. The earth hum was constant. To cancel out, he needed a master frequency. He looked at the geothermal pipes. They ran deep into the subsonic well. They were vibrating with the voice of the mountain itself. He took a long metal rod and pressed it against the pipe, then held the other end to his jawbone. The vibration was agonizing. He felt the history of the valley. The screams, the collapses, the tectonic grinding surged through his teeth. It wasn't just sound, it was data. He saw a flash of the quiet group headquarters in a nearby city, watching the harvest on glowing monitors. He realized the house wasn't just a battery, it was a broadcaster. The quiet group was using the earth hum to send a signal across the world, a subsonic frequency designed to make populations more quiet, more compliant. Suddenly, the door of the shed was ripped off its hinges. 3 listeners stood there, their bodies vibrating in a terrifying unison. They had adjusted to his drone. They were retuning. Elias grabbed the wires. He had no time to build a circuit. He had to be the circuit. He bit down on a metal rod connected to the mountain pipe and grabbed the leads to the speakers with his bare hands. Listen, this. The moment Elias gripped the wires, his world didn't just turn to sound, it turned to electricity. This subsonic well surged through the metal rod, into his jaw, and out through his arms. His muscles locked in a tectonic scream. He was no longer a man. He was a bridge between the tectonic plates and the speakers. The speakers didn't just play a sound. They emitted a physical shockwave. The air in front of the shed rippled like water. The 3 listeners were caught in the blast. Because their bodies were tuned to the hum, the sudden, amplified feedback loop caused them to vibrate at their resonant frequency. Their resin-coated skin began to crack. One of them shattered like a glass statue, its ears dissolving into fine gray powder. The other 2 stumbled back, their sensory organs bleeding a thick, translucent fluid. But the surge did something to Elias's mind. The synesthesia reached its peak. He could see through the ground. The rock became transparent, revealing a network of tunnels beneath Blackwood Manor that pulsed with a dark, rhythmic violet light. At the center of this network, deep beneath the subsonic well, was a chamber containing a massive, fossilized ribcage, the source. It wasn't human. It was something ancient, a creature from a prehistoric age that had evolved to communicate through the very crust of the earth. They're mining a god, Elias realized, his thoughts smelling like burnt ozone. The surge ended as the car battery exploded, throwing Elias into the back wall of the shed. He was deaf, truly deaf this time. His eardrums were blown, but he could still see the sound. The violet pulses from the ground were guiding him. He spotted a heavy steel hatch hidden under a pile of acoustic foam in the corner of the shed. It was the service entrance to the tunnels. He forced the hatch open and descended. The air here was heavy and humid, vibrating with a frequency that made his skin itch. As he moved deeper, the walls changed from dirt to a polished, organic substance. He reached the central chamber. There, he saw the quiet group technicians. They weren't there in person. They were remote listeners, their consciousnesses projected into the chamber through high-tech headsets. They were milking the fossilized source, extracting the subsonic frequencies to beam them to the world above. In the center of the room, suspended in a vat of the acoustic resin, was a human figure. It was hooked up to 1,000 wires. Elias walked closer, his vision blurring. He recognized the face from a photograph in one of the journals. It was the first tenant of Blackwood Manor, the man who had discovered the silence. The man opened his eyes. He didn't speak with his mouth. He spoke through the vibration of the floorboards. Elias, help us break the record. The chamber was a cathedral of organic agony. The source, the prehistoric fossilized ribcage, wasn't just bone. It was interlaced with glowing, synthetic veins that pulsed in time with the signals being broadcast to the surface. The man in the vat, the first tenant, looked like a shriveled husk. His nervous system stretched out like a web to amplify the creature's subsonic moans. Elias, now completely deaf, saw the man's plea as a series of jagged, flickering sparks in the air. The quiet group, they don't just want silence. The man's vibration shook Elias's bones. They want a world that cannot scream. If the earth is quiet, they can write whatever they want into our minds. Elias looked at the control consoles. They were built to handle pure, mathematical frequencies. The quiet group's power relied on order. They controlled the hum because it was a predictable, rhythmic cycle. They can't handle chaos, Elias thought. In acoustics, total harmonic distortion, THD, occurs when a signal is pushed so far beyond its limit that the waveform collapses into noise. Elias realized he didn't need a speaker to break the system. He needed a biological irregularity. He looked at the shriveled man in the vat. How do I stop it? The man's hand, thin as a bird's wing, pointed toward the primary conductor, a massive spike of pure quartz that pierced the center of the fossilized ribcage. The fossil reacts to the heartbeat of the conduit. The vibration whispered, "As long as my heart beats with their machines, the signal is stable. But if a heart beats against the rhythm, if a heart breaks the tempo," Elias understood the sacrifice. The man in the vat was being kept alive by the machine, his heart forced into a perfect robotic 60 beats per minute. Elias stepped toward the vat. He reached for the emergency release lever, but the remote listeners, the projected consciousnesses of the quiet group, began to materialize. They looked like shimmering, translucent ghosts in suits, their faces blurred. They didn't have physical bodies to fight with, but they had sound. Suddenly, the air in the chamber began to solidify. The technicians were focusing a high-frequency sonic wall between Elias and the vat. The pressure was so intense that Elias's skin began to bruise. He felt his ribs groaning under the weight of the invisible sound. He couldn't hear the noise, but he saw it as a wall of blinding, white fire. He fell to his knees. His own heart was racing, 120, 130 beats per minute. The adrenaline was making his pulse erratic. Then he saw it. As his heart rate spiked and became irregular, the violet light in the fossil began to flicker and turn a chaotic, muddy brown. The source was reacting to his proximity. His biological chaos was polluting their perfect signal. The projected ghosts flickered, their forms becoming unstable. They were losing their focus. "You want my heart?" Elias gasped, his vision turning dark. "Then take the whole rhythm." He lunged forward, throwing his entire body into the sonic wall. He wasn't trying to break it. He was trying to let the fossil record his dying, panicked pulse. As Elias slammed his chest against the invisible wall of sound, the quartz spike began to hum with a violent, erratic light. The pure violet glow of the source was being corrupted by his adrenaline-fueled, panicked heartbeat. Thump, 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 thump. The frequency was no longer a smooth wave. It was a jagged saw blade of noise. Upstairs, the listeners in the forest began to clutch their heads, their resin-coated bodies vibrating until they disintegrated into dust. In the chamber, the projected ghosts of the quiet group technicians began to distort like a corrupted video feed. Their blurred faces stretched into digital screams. They weren't just losing their connection. The erratic signal was traveling back up the broadcasting line straight into the brains of the people at the headquarters. The shriveled man in the vat gasped, his eyes rolling back. "It's waking up." Elias reached through the crushing pressure and grabbed the quartz spike. The moment his skin touched the stone, the synesthesia went into a total meltdown. He wasn't just seeing sound, he was seeing time. The fossilized ribcage began to pulse with a deep, earthy warmth. This wasn't a dead object. It was a planetary organism that had been forced into a coma. The quiet group hadn't been mining a mineral. They had been torturing a living consciousness. LISDN, the mountain itself roared. It wasn't a voice in his head anymore. It was a physical displacement of the Earth's crust. The ceiling of the chamber began to crack. Massive slabs of concrete and acoustic foam fell into the vat, shattering the glass. The first tenant was finally free, his body dissolving into the dark liquid as he let out one final, silent breath of relief. But the quiet group wasn't done. From the speakers in the ceiling, a new sound began to play. It was the master override, a frequency designed to kill the source if it ever became unstable. The sound was the absolute zero of noise. It was a frequency so empty that it began to freeze the air. Elias felt his body becoming stiff. The blood in his veins started to crystallize. The quiet group was going to turn the entire valley into a cold zone of permanent, frozen silence to keep the source from waking up. I can't let it stop, Elias thought, his fingers numbing on the cords. He realized he had one advantage. The remote listeners were digital. The source was biological, and he was the bridge. He didn't just hold the spike. He stabbed his own shoulder against the jagged edge of the cords. He let his blood, the warm, chaotic, living fluid, flow into the ancient stone. The source didn't just vibrate then. It inhaled. The moment Elias's blood touched the cords, the absolute zero frequency shattered. The cold, sterile silence of the quiet group was no match for the raw, hot chaos of living biology. The source, the ancient buried entity, didn't just wake up, it erupted. Elias felt his consciousness ripped out of his body. He was no longer in the tunnel. He was everywhere. He was the mountain. He was the tectonic plates. He was the very air vibrating above the Appalachian Range. The Great Awakening. The source let out a sound that the human language has no word for. It was a sonic boom that didn't travel through the air, but through the solid matter of the planet. In New York, London, and Tokyo, people felt a sudden, profound pop in their ears. For one glorious, terrifying second, the entire world was perfectly synchronized to the same heartbeat. In the mind of the mountain, Elias saw the truth. The quiet group wasn't just a corporation. They were a containment unit. They had been using the hum to create an acoustic blanket over the earth. They weren't just suppressing human thought. They were masking the planet. Elias looked up through the eyes of the source, past the atmosphere, into the vacuum of space. Something was out there, a vast, silent predator of sound, a cosmic entity that hunted planets by their acoustic signatures. The Earth had been screaming into the universe for billions of years, and the predator was closing in. The quiet group had discovered the source and realized they could use its subsonic power to turn the Earth silent to the rest of the galaxy. We were hiding in the shadows of the sound. The source's consciousness vibrated through Elias. But the price of silence was the death of your souls. To stay hidden, you had to forget how to feel. The remote listeners at the headquarters were screaming. Their digital headsets were melting. This sonic boom had traced their signal back to the source and delivered a truth frequency that was literally tearing their buildings apart. Elias saw the quiet group's main hub, a skyscraper in a nameless city, collapse into a pile of dust as the order was replaced by chaos. But the mask was now gone. The Earth was shining with sound again. The cosmic predator would now hear the planet's heartbeat. Elias, the source whispered, its ancient ribs beginning to shift and move as if it were preparing to dig its way out of the earth. The silence is over, but the hunting begins. You must decide, will you die in the quiet or fight in the noise? Elias felt his physical body again. The chamber was collapsing. The violet light was blinding. He saw the surface of the mountain cracking open, revealing a creature made of living sound and ancient stone. The ground beneath Blackwood Manor didn't just shake, it unzipped. As Elias scrambled out of the collapsing service hatch, the entire hillside slid away, revealing the source in its full, terrifying glory. It was a colossus of crystalline bone and vibrating earth, a living antenna that had been buried since the dawn of time. Elias stood on the edge of the new crater, his clothes torn and his skin glowing with a faint, bioluminescent violet. He was still deaf to the wind, but he could hear the song of the world. Every person on Earth was now connected. This sonic boom had permanently tuned human DNA to the frequency of the source. Across the globe, people were stepping out of their houses, looking at each other with wide eyes. They weren't speaking, they were resonating. They could feel each other's grief, joy, and fear as physical vibrations. But then, the sky began to darken. It wasn't a cloud or an eclipse. It was the cosmic predator. It looked like a vast, translucent veil of negative sound, a creature that existed only as a vacuum, traveling through the stars to consume the vibrance of living worlds. As it entered the atmosphere, it began to drink the noise of the earth. The birds fell silent. The oceans stopped roaring. A suffocating, unnatural quiet began to spread from the upper atmosphere downward. "It is here," the source's voice rumbled through Elias's feet. "The silence that devours." Elias realized the quiet group had been right about one thing. The earth was a target. But they were wrong about the defense. You don't fight a vacuum by being empty. You fight it by filling it until it bursts. "We have to scream," Elias whispered. He didn't use his voice. He used his mind, projecting his intent into the quartz-rich soil beneath him. Through his connection to the source, Elias became the conductor of the human race. He sent a pulse out to every living soul. Don't be afraid. Remember the sound of your heart. Remember the noise of your love. Together. Now, 8 billion hearts began to beat in a single, chaotic, beautiful rhythm. Elias grabbed a shard of the quartz spike that had remained embedded in his palm. He held it toward the sky. The source behind him reared back and let out a roar that bypassed the air entirely, traveling through the acoustic web of the human race. The earth didn't just make a sound, it became a siren. The violet light shot up from the Appalachian Mountains, joined by billions of smaller sparks from every city and village. This wasn't the order of the quiet group. This was the chaos of life. The predator hit the wall of sound and recoiled. A vacuum cannot consume a sun. The sheer density of the Earth's collective noise was too much for the creature of silence. It began to fray at the edges, its translucent body shattering into harmless cosmic dust that fell to the earth like glowing snow. 1 year later, the world is no longer quiet, but it is no longer loud. The ringing in people's ears has been replaced by a soft, melodic hum, the background radiation of life. The quiet group is a memory, their silent buildings now repurposed as music halls, where people go to learn how to play their own heartbeats. Elias Thorne lives at the bottom of the crater where Blackwood Manor once stood. He never regained his hearing, and he never left the mountain. He doesn't need to. He spends his days with his hands pressed against the ancient, warm ribs of the source. He is no longer a data analyst. He is the groundsman. Whenever the sky grows a little too dark, or the world grows a little too cold, Elias closes his eyes and hums a single, low note. And the earth, in all its messy, beautiful, and eternal noise, hums right back.